Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending where you're connecting in from today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to come listen to another advanced user training session on Storyboard. Of course, today's session is about how you can reduce the amount of effort it takes for creating things like tables and lists within your Storyboard GUI applications using some of the great new enhancements that we've added to Storyboard. Just to let you know that today's session will be recorded, so that way you'll have the recording made available to you, as well as if you have any colleagues that you think would benefit from this session, they can easily get access to it via on demand. Also, if you have any questions about anything being discussed today, please use your Q&A window that you can find within your screen to pose your questions. As well, if you haven't followed us on any of the social platforms, we are active on all of them, and you can follow us using the hashtag GUI development or hashtag crank storyboard. Today, we're lucky enough to have Toma Fletcher, who is the head of innovation at AMETEK Crank, and he is basically the lead person that basically guides the development of Storyboard. Today I'm going to jump in, give you a little brief overview on Storyboard, and then we're going to jump into how to leverage the new dynamic table and list creation within Storyboard by covering how to convert static content into movable content, as well as how to dynamically load content for configuration display at runtime, as well as linking tables and lists to external data sources to create more of a dynamic table creation. And then at the end, we'll answer any questions that you have. So let's jump into it. So when it comes down to it, the founders of Storyboard really kind of set out to build a solution that could help remove the inefficiencies that they, and of course, as their developer colleagues often encountered when developing GUI applications for embedded devices, whether it was MPUs or MCUs. So based upon over 2 decades of GUI application experience in developing for embedded systems, Storyboard was really designed to remove those issues or barriers that impeded the efficient development process or workflow that hindered creating exceptional GUI applications in a quick manner. So that way you could get the time on market and on budget. So this is all done by decoupling the front-end GUI from the back-end logic. So by doing so, Storyboard provides this collaborative workflow that really enables both GUI designers and developers to work in parallel together to build the GUI application. Also, not only is AMETEK Crank a software development company, but we're also a services company. So if you have a need for a prototype to be developed fast, for maybe a proof of concept with key stakeholders, or maybe you have an idea but not the time, or maybe you have the resources to produce it, or maybe even you're looking for ways that, how you can optimize the performance of the GUI application you're building using Storyboard. No matter what it is you're looking to do or looking to create, our team of Storyboard designers and developers are here to make your embedded project easier. So we can help you from start to finish, whether it's planning, implementation, and maintenance of your GUI, or placing it through rigorous testing to uncover any issues that could impact the performance of your product later on. So if you have a need for anything like that, feel free to reach out to our professional services teams. Also, if you haven't visited our help center, here you'll find a wealth of information, whether it's things like our product documentation for Storyboard or knowledge-based articles and videos really helping you to resolve a particular issue that you may have come across, as well as a bunch of videos from how to get started on using the different features and functionality, as well as access to things like this. Our advanced user training sessions can all be found here within our help center. So check it out today if you haven't. Also within there, you also find our community section where you can reach out to other like-minded GUI application engineers and pose maybe questions that you're coming across and get help by either people here at AMETEK Crank or by your colleagues out in the field. So with that being said, I'm going to pass things over to Toma, and he's going to really jump into the meat of today's, which is, of course, creating dynamic table creation within Storyboard.
Super. Thank you very much, Scott. What a great, great introduction. Great to understand the values of the product and some of the things that we can bring to you. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here, and let's get going. We're going to do most of our work inside Storyboard today. Scott decided that the focus was not on my face and the good-looking clothes that I'm wearing today, but rather on the product itself. So that's okay with me. We'll dive into that. So today we're going to be looking at some functionality that was added into Storyboard 7.1, our latest release, that helps you navigate the process of creating lists, creating scrollable content. And really what it is it's a build on top of the existing functionality with a bunch of sort of user facilitation. These are things that you could have done before. And I'm going to take you kind of through a little bit of a story journey here. But you could have done it before, but the amount of effort that was involved was, it was a lot of clicking. It was a lot of, kind of setting things up. And what we did was we've been watching patterns of people using the product over the years. And this was just a common refrain. And we said, we can make that easier. We can make that a little bit faster. So here I am inside of Storyboard, inside of our workspace. So I'm just going to come into a clean workspace. The first thing I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to take a Photoshop application, a little home panel that we've got as a demonstration, and I'm going to work with one of those panels. So I'm going to start with our Photoshop import just to get some content in so that we can work with it, our home automation platform. If you haven't seen this process before, if you're new to Storyboard, this is your first user training, then I would encourage you to go back and take a look at some of the earlier sessions that we've done where we take you through the process of Photoshop and Sketch content import and how you can kind of rapidly go from design files into the working environment of Storyboard. It is got a lot of options, lots of details, but not necessarily something we're going to touch on today. So what I wanted to look at is I want to kind of focus on this setting screen as a typical scenario that people run into. You can see here we've got a static design where we have a number of different options, and you can imagine that there may be more options than what we see here, right? That the design may have just put these in as proxy placeholders, sort of just to kind of guide the visual intent of what we're doing. So a lot of times when we come into this type of an application, we actually want to expand it. What we're going to do is we're going to turn this into, a scrollable list, right? Something where I can move the content up and down and slide it all around, to go through various options. So historically, we might have looked at these imported elements, and you can see that each one of them are, sort of individual elements here visually. We might have gone through and taken that and, kind of moved them onto a scrolling layer, or tried to put them into, sort of a scrolling table and kind of unified the experience. And that is, sort of just a mechanical process. So we decided, well, that should be a functionality we can build right into Storyboard. And so that's exactly what we've done. So now I can come into this screen and I can grab the controls that I'm interested in, right? In this case, I'm just going to choose them in our application model view. It's a little bit clearer to sort of see how they're all organized. I can come in here, and what I can do now is under the Convert To menu, what you'll find is that there's a Convert Selection to Scrolling Layer. There's also a Convert Selection to Scrolling Table, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The reason that we were interested in the scrolling layer is that this is content that is non-uniform. This content is, a lot of different controls, different sizes, different positions. We'd like to be able to scroll it, but we anticipate that, there may be other elements that we're going to manually contribute and lay out because of, kind of a dynamic backend or, data feeding in. So now if I select this Convert Selection to Scrolling Layer, what's going to happen is it's going to take all those controls and it's going to move them onto a new layer. And so you can see that there is a new layer created here. Visually, nothing appears to have changed. But there's a new layer here, and we can see in my settings layer where previously those controls were, they're all gone, right? They've been moved out of that layer, and they've been put onto this new Storyboard layer, and that's been added into your project. And this new layer is being configured to enable scrolling. So what does that mean? Well, that means that really in a few clicks here, I went through and I said, well, this is supposed to be a list. And let's just turn this screen into our primary screen so that we can work with it a little bit more easier. I'm going to jump into the simulator. I'm going to run the application now. And what I get now is not only when we did the Photoshop import, did we get sort of the automatic button behavior, right? I didn't have to add any actions for that. But now what I've got is I've got automatic list behavior. Now we still only have 3 elements on our layer here, but we're primed and we're set up so that in the future, if we want to start adding things, there's going to be a natural fit, right? We're going to put them on this scrolling layer and it's going to continue to, kind of bump these things down and move them along. Now, how do you know that this is all the content that's on this layer? Well, you can use this toggle visibility. Now, some of you may have jumped into Storyboard 7.1 and there's a new feature that we've added, and I'm just going to take an opportunity to talk about it now. It's not really directly related to our scrolling list story, but it's always nice to talk about a few features, that we're using at the same time. If you select the visibility, just to kind of toggle it, make sure that the content on that scrolling layer is what you expect it to be, and it disappears on you entirely, you're probably experiencing our new feature here, which allows us to filter content out that's not visible. It really allows you to compact your display, but it can be a little surprising if all of a sudden those hidden items just start disappearing. You think they're deleted. So if that's happening to you, simply click the eyeball at the top here and you'll see that those things come back. So a really quick overview, of how we actually get to this functionality. Like I said, these are things that you could have done before. You could have taken the content manually, created a new layer, enabled scrolling on it, move the content across. But this just moves that process along a little bit more smoothly for you. Now, the next thing I like to talk about is something that's got a little bit more depth to it, and that's the convert to scrolling table. We're going to explore that other option. For that, I have another Photoshop file that I'm interested in working with. I asked my graphic designer to put together something that was going to be, sort of maybe a color selector, something that that we'd be able to quickly feed with a data source. And this is what he gave me, which is, I guess, a wrestling color selector. Which, I'm a fan of the 80s and 90s. I was watching wrestling at that time, so we'll work with that. So again, we're going to start the process in the same way. We're going to Photoshop import that Wrestling Mania application, and we'll bring it in. It'll give us a new baseline. Now, because I'm coming from Photoshop, I can select these elements, but I can also see that the content that I imported came in as a series of images. The idea here is that I'd like to build a color selector of some sort. So rather than have these controls show content as images and subsequently text and other kind of images, I'd like to refactor that a little bit. So we have facilities, again, opportunity to talk about some new things in 7.1. We have some facilities that have been improved where we can convert images to fills. And what this will do is, this is particularly handy when you're coming from a graphic design import, where a lot of the time, the visual elements that you're going to see within the design are going to be turned into rasterized images, but they can be represented more precisely and with a smaller footprint as more or less vector operations. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to turn those solid images into a fill block. And then what that's going to allow us to do is we'll be able to dynamically populate both the labels and these little color swatches with some external data source. So to do that, and I like to bring up the metrics view, just to kind of give us an idea. Our estimation on this project is 1.8. We expect that if I perform this conversion, convert these images to fills, you can see here I have all the color swatches have been identified, each of them associated, but there's also some other images in here that can be converted to fills as well. So I'm going to go through and just choose all of those and say, yes, I'd like to delete the images now that they've been converted. Say yes, and you can see here, my recalculation, I've actually dropped 600K of, or not 600K, 6K of memory. This is a very small application, but those images would have contributed to whether it was my flash size or my heap size, and that's being replaced now with just raw draw operations. when I look at the properties on these controls, I can see now they're fills and, text elements remain. So this is great because it puts me in a position of being able to start looking at how do I convert this to, more dynamic content. Now I can select these elements. I'm doing it here in the graphic design area, but I could do it in the application model as well. Again, I can look at the convert to. I still have the option to convert to a scrolling layer, and I could go ahead and I could do that. But because I'm looking at this as very uniform, very templated, each one of these controls is exactly the same as the other one, and I'm expecting to have a large volume of data here, then the selection to scrolling table really is a great fit. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. It's also, kind of the purpose of this AT is to give you guys a different experience. So you see now my controls here that were previously on this layer have been replaced with a single table. The table has 3 cells representing the 3 controls that I had previously. And when I look at the template, because each of those controls was uniformly composited, right, the same fill, text, background images, or converted now background fills, I can see that where there was differences, it's been converted into variables, right? So the template is all the same, but each of the cells is differentiated by the use of cell label or table variables, right, that are identified on a per cell basis. If I come down and I take a look here, I can see, these compound variables still with the same content sitting here. So just in and of itself, that change, right, being able to very quickly go from the static content, the graphic design team doesn't really have a way of creating a table with table cells and kind of put that together. Right now, I've done that fairly slowly here, but you can imagine a process where you really select those controls, right click, say convert. And now when I simulate, I've already got, sort of a table in place, ready to go, ready to, kind of be filled with data. So this would be, at this point, on par with, making a selection of, do I go with a scrolling layer? If I have non-uniform content, my content looks different, I expect to be able to put different types of controls or groups down onto that layer. Scrolling layer is the way to go. If I have uniform content and I, kind of high volume, and I want to be able to manage the data, sort of in a uniform way, then a scrolling table is definitely the way to go. Because now what we can do is we can look at the second part of what we've added into 7.1 here, is that on the table, not only do we have, scrolling automatically enabled, and you can come through and of course tune this behavior to whatever you like, we have a data source tab. And this data source is really the link now between, what we would have had to do previously. If I wanted to go create a table and change these values, I would go through and edit each one of the variables, or I might say I want to add additional variables if I want to make the table larger or smaller, put more content in. We give you a faster way to get to that today. So this data source panel is where that all begins. And the first thing we would want to do is get a template for what a data source might look like. And so we can take the existing content, again, started with Photoshop, worked into our design, converted to a table, and now I can export this data source to, I'm going to put it out in this new directory here, to an external file. And what that's doing is it's taking the variables that are defined, so these 2 labels, right, text and color, and the 3 values associated with those labels, so 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3 here, and I'm putting them out into an external data file. And what that lets me do is now I can come and take a look at that, and I can work with that as external data. And I don't have to care about how it's being used by the user interface. If I want to prototype what a large volume of data looks like, it's easy for me to come in here and take this and start cutting and pasting and putting new blocks in. Or, for example, if I want to go in here and say, actually, who I really like? I love Jimmy Superfly Snuka. And I think he actually should be right in this list, right? So I can come in, I can modify that data externally, and then I can synchronize it by choosing to import the same data source, right? So I exported the data source to get the key value pairs to give me a template to work with. Now I've imported it. And you can see I've imported 3 values. The import data source is automatically matched the variables that I have in my storyboard table. So color and text here, color and text. Those are the cell variables to variables available in the data source. Now, in this case, because I went from an export process, the color and text variables were automatically there. I really just went and changed the content. But if I were to say synchronize the table here at this point, what's going to happen is that imported data source is going to be aligned, and all the new variables and values are going to be set up, and you're going to get a quick way to sort of set, in this case, 6 variables with new values. And I can see right away that by putting that new proxy data in, I've got a bit of a problem here, because this text needs to have a little bit of behavioral change, right? So I'm going to put an ellipsis at the end to say, if we get a long name, let's start putting an ellipsis at the end of that. And that's not something that we can do through the Photoshop import, because we're working with static text, right? So this gives us kind of a quick way to kind of iterate through that and take a look at it. So what else can I do? So again, this change is made live. These are changes that are happening at design time and pushed out. Oh, seem to have lost my application there. These are changes that are happening at design time and being pushed out. If I wanted to, now I could give this data file and provide this as a template to somebody else, and they can go and they can, generate more data for me. So that's what I've got here with our small list import, is that I've given that data file to some content producer, and they've come back and they filled it in. Now, originally I had talked to them about doing a color swatch. So of course they were all set to put in the colors, but they also had the color names. Instead, we've provided them with a wrestling list. So they decided to do me a solid here. And now what I've got is also a list of wrestlers to go with these colors and the color names. So I can get that into the storyboard very, very quickly. And you'll notice that there's many more items here. There's, I think, 10 items in this list. So now when I do an import, I can choose that small data list. And again, the first step here is we've assigned it, we've associated it, but we haven't actually synchronized the design content. If I synchronize the design content, then you can see what's happened, is that it's gone through and it's gone and matched up the color labels and the text labels. And of course I can simulate this and I can go ahead and run this. And you see the full values in here, but they've also been changed in the design. I've expanded my variable list out to 10. Now, as much as I like the colors, I was kind of getting, the idea of the wrestling list was kind of growing on me. So maybe what I want to do is, instead of making the text association, I can choose which values I want to associate. So in this case, I'm going to choose to associate the name field instead. And when I synchronize now, now I'm back to my list of wrestlers, which, pleases me a little bit here. So I can go ahead, save this. And again, I've got my list of wrestlers, and all that's coming again from the design stage, right? This is not the live runtime component. This is just the design elements. If I wanted to make this sort of a permanent mapping, instead of saying text, which was the default variable that was assigned when I did my Photoshop import and my table conversion, I can actually go through and I can make this change now. When I synchronize the table, if I say match the variable names, just for future reference, I like to sort of stay aligned. I can go ahead and do that. And what you'll see now is in the template, instead of the variable being referenced as text, it's actually referenced as name. And I have a new variable down here called name that's populated it. And so this text variable here essentially is dead. I don't need this anymore. I can delete this variable. It's not being referenced. And we have tools that allow you to kind of clean that stuff up. We don't delete it automatically, because you may want to use it for some future purpose. And we want to kind of leave that option open to you. So this is all very handy, right? This is a very quick way to get dynamic content in at design time, to filter it through, to try out different things, to kind of quickly move things through. But ultimately, what we also would like to do is we'd like to be able to apply these data sources, now that we've got the mechanism for bringing it into the design and evaluating it through our simulation. We'd like to also be able to use the same functionality at runtime, because oftentimes when we're working with scrolling content, the reason that we have scrolling content is it gives us sort of an unbounded mechanism by which we can present a user interface that we don't know in advance where the end is. We don't know how much data is going to be there, and that's why the list is very handy. So we have another button down here called Create Lua Data Source. And so if I do a Lua Data Source right now with a small list import, what you'll see here is over in the Lua section that there's a new set of Lua files that have been added into the project. So this list data sources is the first one we want to take a look at. And we won't go too deeply into the Lua code here. It's not really the AUT for that, but just to kind of give you an idea of what data is being stored. Here we can see that we've got the table that we're working with, right? We never change the default name from table. We have the source of data that we want to work with. And since I'm working on my desktop and I'm not putting these data files inside the project, it's an absolute path. Now, this is something that you can absolutely change, or if the data files were inside the project, it would be a project relative path. Then what we have is we have a mapping of which fields are being extracted from that data source and what variables should they be applied to in the context of this model object, right? So relatively simple. And now what happens is when I simulate, you'll see that there's this little statement down here, processing 10 entries, but it looks exactly the same. Well, how do I know that it's any different? What's going on behind the scenes? Well, behind the scenes, we're using these Lua modules, the SPC data source module, which used to be a data component, and we're using a JSON parser. And we're taking this data and we're parsing it dynamically, and we're bringing it in. So even though the variables are actually all the same, we are processing it live. And just to show you what that means is I can associate a larger data source, right? So I can say that here's my full list, and I can associate this larger data source. And now I've got the full list as the association. Inside the project itself, however, I'm still only working with 10 elements, right? So those are the 10 elements from my small list. Now when I simulate, what you'll see here is that my list is much, much larger because I'm pulling those data. I'm pulling, in fact, 148 entries out of my data source, and I'm parsing them in live at runtime. The way I'm doing that is this data source module is taking advantage of some functionality that was introduced, I believe, in 7.0, Storyboard 7, where we can add in event listeners. So we can add in an initialization event listener. And then that will run through our populate list, which is going to use the list data source here that we've exported from Designer. And it's going to use that as the basis for where should I pull the data, what variable should I set, how big should the table be. And you can see here, we're planning for the future. Right now, we're only supporting tables. In the future, we will be looking at templating layers and those controls that are, kind of disparate that you've got, and being able to put that out in terms of a layout. We're also looking towards the future and saying, well, what other data formats do we have? We have JSON data formats, data sources. We have CSV file data sources. We have other databases. How do we want to pull those things in? So what you're going to see in the next few releases is this functionality is simply going to expand and become a little bit more pervasive, shared between the functionality that we have in the translation. And, we have an AUT that talks about translation and how those databases work. To be aligned so that you've got the same formats, the same data, the same mechanisms, and you're using it all throughout, whether it's a data source, whether it's for translation purposes or internationalization purposes, it'll all come together. So that's sort of where we're at with 7.1. It's a useful feature right now, both in the design time for being able to very quickly take static content and turn it into something which kind of has some scrollable mechanics through our scrolling layer, or if you have uniform content, being able to take that, export template data source based on the table variables you've got, and then be able to kind of re-import that and align it and kind of make larger, more dynamic interfaces that are actually populated with real data. Because that's really all the challenge, is that you could do all this by hand, but if I had to go through and put 20 entries in, that would probably take me a couple of minutes. If I had to do 100 entries, I would probably just not do it. This gives me a very easy way to kind of bring data in, flip it around, try it out. I can try it out in different languages. I can try it out with different styles. And I can make corrections like you saw here, where I can make adjustments very quickly because I've got real data that I'm working with, or at least proxied real data. So hopefully you found this AUT useful, give you a little bit of insight in terms of what we're doing and where we're going. And I don't know, Scott, if we're in a position to take questions today. I'm not sure, sort of where we want to go from a time perspective, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Yeah, for sure. Let me just kind of wrap things up here. Just some key takeaways, and then we'll jump into the Q&A session. So again, just like I reminded you at the beginning, is that if you have not had a chance or you haven't been there yet, take a look at our help center. There is a wealth of additional resources, information there for you, whether it's, like I said, getting started videos for some of the key basic elements within Storyboard, or access to a lot of the advanced concepts, whether it's through knowledge base articles or through our advanced user training sessions such as today. So definitely, if you haven't taken a look at it, we weren't aware that we were running these sessions, that we have a back catalog of sessions touching upon many of the different elements that we've introduced over the past couple of years. So definitely check that out. So with that being said, let's jump into the questions. So Toma, I do have a question. So does the data source file need to be a JSON file?
It doesn't need to be a JSON file. So today, the designer interface supports JSON, as a common, well-defined data format that we can represent any one of the, the storyboard data elements inside of. In our translation story, we typically use CSV files. And the reason I was showing that Lua snippet that works at the runtime is because that code is in your hands. Once you've brought it into your project, you're able to customize it. You can use the same concept in terms of startup initialization, but bind it to your own data source. So really what we're doing is we're giving you kind of a kickstart out of the box, JSON all around. But if you want to go and do something different, or you've got a more suitable database, or you've got a data source for your runtime configuration that makes more sense for what you're doing, then that's an easy spot to get in and customize.
Perfect. I have another one. What process do you suggest to use if the content is not uniform?
So the non-uniform content right now, really your best approach, and the reason that we kind of gave this facility to the engine and to designer, is to use a scrolling layer. And that's because our table, table approach is that tables have templates, and those templates are meant to, look and feel the same, right? So you get that same sort of consistent feel. Mechanically, they use the same implementation behind the scenes. So it's not like you're trading, kind of one's more efficient or one's not. It's simply that one is designed around this notion of everything looks the same, and the other one is designed around the sense that you're going to take a little bit of ownership of what the layout is going to be and what the content is going to be, because you have something a little bit more custom.
Perfect. That seems to be all the questions. So I want to say thank you, Toma, for sharing your wisdom on dynamic table creation today, and to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to join us. And we look forward to seeing you in our next advanced user training session.